The sky gave birth to an orange and gold borealis as the sun pierced violently through foreboding clouds in anticipation of an early winter sunset. Its radiance gleamed majestically like blazing fire off Rathmane's ornate armor, while his hooves pounded the earth, echoing like drums of chaos. As fast as the wind, we rode across open plains that bordered funereal woodlands in search of Karagol. Just ahead of me was the Auyunai nobleman Azanthine, mounted on the back of his winged, black, vampiric elk steed, Merklethanon, whose mighty antlers cut through the air like deadly spears. The crimson eyes of the newly changed beast glowed eerily through the gloom, and a green mist shrouded him as he galloped forth, fangs protruding from his frothing lips. Before coming to a thicket that led into the swamp, Azanthine reached his arm out and pointed a slender finger to the forest that fringed the land to our right. He then steered Merklethanon toward the area he had indicated, and I followed. Our gallop slowed to a halt, and I came up beside him as we entered a winding dirt path in the brooding woods. Orange accents from the setting sun filtered upon the ground through the skeletal boughs above. "I smell the blood of the innocent," said Azanthine. "If evildoers be near, then they deserve to die. And if that is the case, then it may be to our great advantage. Remember, I have the power to change humans into vampires. You need to spill the blood of vampires in order to activate your powers. It would be wise of us to enter Karagol and the lair of Nesadontha with your cosmic energy fully charged. Don't you agree?" "Indeed," I said. "But you said it wasn't in your nature to drink the blood of humans." The Auyunai looked down as if ashamed. He then fixed his eyes on mine, and his expression quickly changed to that of grim determination. "I will make an exception this once for our cause," he replied. "Although frowned upon by my ancestors, I vow that this day the blood of man is the blood of vengeance." He reared Merklethanon and continued down the crude woodland lane. I followed. A dense gray fog permeated the forest, and the howling of timber wolves could be heard in the distance. A drop of blood dripped on my helm, and I looked up to behold an old screech owl just emerged from its roost, already dining on an unfortunate rodent. Azanthine stopped and signaled for me to halt as well. "They are just ahead. Look." Peering through the dead branches of a fallen locust, I saw in the distance 4 men standing in an area where the trees thinned a bit. Robed in purple silks and wearing gold amulets around their necks, each had a scabbarded sword at his waist. They were gathered around a crudely made, blood-bedewed stone altar, upon which lay a naked young girl, bound, gagged, and writhing on the stained slate. Lying on the ground in a pool of blood was the dead body of another young maid who had obviously just been slain upon the altar. To the left of the girl was a shirtless male youth tied to a large stake jutting from the ground. There was straw and kindling piled at his feet, and it looked as if the robed men were planning to burn him alive. Nearby were their mounts, 4 brown mares standing in wait. One of the men read aloud from a leather-bound tome. "Great Lord, accept our sacrifice, for with the blood of these mortals spilled upon this altar, we grant our offering to you." Looking closer, I saw the gold amulets they wore bore the insignia of the cult of Gormantia, the same symbol that used to be etched upon the breast of my armor, and the one that I previously used to transport myself to the Dark One's castle. The mark had long since vanished from my mail since its destruction, and an empty space now resided there surrounded by other rooms. But seeing it again, and realizing these foolish humans were trying to summon the bastard back from the grave, enraged me to the fullest extent. I instinctively gripped the reins and was about to surge into the scene. Not yet. Sensing my anger, Azenthine put his hand on my arm, steadying me. Remember, do not slay until I have changed them. As the violet-robed man continued to read, another drew his sword and walked over to stand above the squirming girl. He raised the blade in the air and held it over the distressed maid in anticipation of driving it through her heart. King of the undead, rise from thy sleep! A banquet of the most precious flesh we have laid out for thee. Come forth and gorge as this pure body pours its bright vermilion hoard about the weltering stone. We summon thee, Lord Gormantia! As these last words were spoken, Azenthine reared Merklethanon and charged from the forest gloom into the space occupied by the murderers. Before the surprised cult member holding the sword could plunge it through the girl's chest, Azenthine leapt from the back of his vampiric elk and came down upon the man, knocking him to the ground and causing his sword to fly from his grasp. As the fiend struggled to rise, the vampire held him to the earth. Gripping him by his now exposed shaggy brown hair, he pulled his head back, revealing his naked white neck. Fangs bared, slavering, and looking more ferocious than I had previously witnessed, Azenthine bit down into the man's veins. One of the men-at-arms attempted to attack the vampire in order to save his comrade, and received a swift kick to the skull by Merklethanon, which knocked him unconscious. Azenthine lifted his head up from drinking and gasped for air as if emerging from water. Hissing and growling in ecstasy, his reddened mouth dripped with crimson gore, and his eyes were savage with bloodlust. He must have been extremely strong-willed, as I could tell he took just enough blood to cause the transformation and had to force himself to stop. Seeing the unconscious man upon the ground, Azenthine rose and moved from his current prey to begin feasting upon the next victim. Merklethanon stood between the vampire and the remaining cultists, guarding him while he drank. Reluctant to abandon the ritual due to this interference, the man holding the book stepped back and began chanting protective spells. The other armed man lunged forward, attempting to slash the enormous elk with his sword. The vampiric beast avoided the blow by opening his mighty jaws and chomping down into the attacker's arm as he thrusted. Merklethanon thrashed his head once and violently ripped the man's arm from his socket. Blood poured from the wound, dyeing his purple garment a deep scarlet, and the man fell to his knees howling. Having his first taste of blood, the elk could not resist. He leaned down and, opening his maw abnormally wide for an animal of his breed, bit down into the side of the crippled man's abdomen, burying his huge fangs into flesh and bone. The man's eyes rolled back, and he screamed wildly as Merklethanon greedily devoured his lifeblood. The florid luster of the beast's glowing eyes blazed brighter as he drank, and his black leathern wings quivered in delight. Once finished with the unconscious victim, Azenthine was upon his feet and advancing upon the chanting sect affiliate, who didn't have time to finish his incantation. The horror-struck follower dropped the book and drew his sword to defend himself. The blood-satiated vampire grinned mirthlessly and withdrew his rapier from his scabbard. He struck once and was parried. The man counterattacked, and a duel of steel on steel ensued. Watching through the trees in anticipation, I saw that while the swordsman battled and the vampiric elk feasted, the drained bodies of the two fallen cultists were beginning to arise. Moving in weird, staggering motions, the robed figures stood upon their feet, taking their first looks at the world through undead eyes. This was my signal to move in. I urged Wrathmane and, bursting through the thicket, plunged into the fray. One of the newly risen wraiths was advancing toward the frightened girl bound upon the altar, ready for its first meal. Wrathmane galloped forth, and unsheathing my broadsword, I swung a blurring arc into the neck of the creature. As the blade hit home, the thing's head went flying, and a fine blood mist sprayed the fair skin of the naked girl. Before the headless body of the slain vampire could hit the ground, its undead soul was released from the oozing stump where its head used to be. As the whirling ghost matter soared into my armor like a moth to a flame, I felt a great surge of strength run through my body and soul. The cosmic ice was activated. The frozen spirit-inhabited substance started encasing my entire frame. Wrathmane roared in triumph, also empowered. His eyes illuminated azure, and a frosty smoke lifted from his nostrils whilst the phantom energy eerily cascaded throughout his armor. Another fiend was approaching the male youth tied to the wooden stake. I turned to face it, pulled the reins, and brought my warhorse down upon the wretch, stomping it into the ground beneath heavy, ice-clad hooves, breaking almost every bone in his cursed body. I dismounted quickly, and as Wrathmane stepped away, I dropped to one knee and drove my glowing steel through the back of the vampire's broken body, piercing its black heart with ease, and sending its soul to join the other in my armor, rather than to burn in the fires of hell. I saw that the body of the third corpse was reanimating as well. Having completely drained it, Merklethanon had since abandoned the bloodless husk and appeared to be feasting upon the decapitated head of the previously slain vampire, devouring it like a spring watermelon. Azanthine and the lead cultist were still feuding, which seemed more like a malicious game to the Auyunai. They fought in circles around the altar. The vampire smiled and laughed jubilantly as he slashed and parried with his antique rapier. Gracefully he whirled and spun, as if taking part in an elegant dance rather than a sword fight. His red cape flowed in the breeze, as did his sleek raven-black mane that framed his pale, blood-stained face, now orange, illuminated by the setting sunlight filtering through the trees. He was on the offense as he mercilessly drove the sweating partisan backwards. It was all the struggling man could do to keep his footing. At last, weary of swordplay, Azanthine slashed his opponent's sword arm, severing the tendon in his wrist and causing him to drop his weapon. He then lunged forward and grasped the disarmed Energumen by his throat. He ripped the golden pendant bearing the insignia of Gormantia from around the man's neck. Azanthine held it before him and spat upon it. "Traitor!" The vampire growled through clenched fangs, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and dilated. "If you so love the bastard, perhaps you wish to become like him! For your treachery against all that is good and holy, I vow that this day forth thou art damned!" Without hesitation, Azanthine pulled back the cultist's head and bit down into his neck. The man screamed and his eyes rolled back as his blood was drunk. As I finished slaying the third newly changed devil, I noticed that Azanthine was taking much longer with this last victim. I knew he had already drunk enough blood to change the man, and was ravaging greedily like a common vampire. Knowing that this was against the moral code of his ancestors, and that he would not wish for it to occur, but was not in his normal state of mind, I intervened. "Azanthine, enough!" I said as I ran over and pulled him away from the drained man. He gasped and fell backward upon the ground, with crimson ichor gushing from his mouth. I looked at the man's face. His transformation had begun, and he was stirring as a fanged menace. Without hesitation, I raised my blade and with 2 hands buried it in the chest of the evil monstrosity, absorbing the vampiric life force with glee. Azenthine was sitting upon the ground, recovering from the fit of bloodlust that had possessed him. He was breathing heavily and looked stunned. "Never let me do this again, Karnov," he said, realizing that he had almost gone too far toward becoming like those he hated. "The work is done," I said, grabbing his hand and helping him regain his standing. "Come, let us continue with our plan." With the bloodlust and soul-quenching finished, I approached the restrained youth and cut his bonds. Once free, the lad staggered backwards trembling, obviously fearful of my appearance and terrified by what he had just witnessed. I walked over to where the mares were tied, untethered the largest and led it over to the boy. I then reached to the ground and picked up a sword dropped by one of the fallen men. I handed it to him, hilt first. "Here," I said. "Take this weapon and this steed and carry the lass back to safety. There is a full moon tonight. Stay on the path and you should easily be able to navigate through the woodland. Do you know your way to the nearest town?" The youth said nothing but stared at me, mouth agape. He then nodded slowly. Standing near the altar, Azenthine made 4 quick swipes with the tip of his rapier, severing the girl's bonds. She rose from the stone and fled from him, running and sobbing into the arms of the muscled youth. I turned and mounted Wrathbane. "Thank you, warrior," said the lad finally as he embraced the girl. Looking down at him from beneath my helm of glowing spirit mail, I nodded and said, "Thank the will of one of a proud lineage that saved you this night." I glanced toward Azenthine, who had mounted Merclethenon. The vampire wiped blood from his mouth and nodded once uncomfortably before beginning to advance ahead. "And tell all you meet who bear the symbol of these cult men that their time of death is near. For it is no longer only souls of the undead that need fear the vengeance of Karnov and the wrath of Azenthine." With that, I reared my empowered steed and then sped off, galloping down through the darkened woods, followed closely by my companion, leaving only trails of blood and the green, otherworldly mist of Merclethenon's essence to linger behind.